and welcome to the Knowledge Pool, your source for everything regarding the rules of Magic the Gathering. Today we'll be going over all the new commanders from the Bedecked Brokers Deck, the new banned deck that was released along with the set Streets of New Capenna. Let's begin. Up first is the cover commander for this deck, Perie the Pulverizer. It's 1 and banned colors for a 3/3 legendary creature Rhino Soldier. When Perie enters the battlefield, put the seal counter on target creature, and when Perie attacks target creature you control, gains trample and gets +X/+H at the end of turn, where X is the number of different kinds among permanents you control. So, rules wise here. Perie does not enter with a counter, it's an ETB that puts a counter on a creature, even himself, and you can also put it on another player's creature because it doesn't say target creature you control. So, after you target the creatures, your opponents have a chance to respawn and kill the creature, so they kill it before it gets a seal counter. And as for the second ability, again you can target any creature you control. It doesn't have to be to target Perie, but you have to target the creature you control. You cannot choose an opponent, and Perie has to be attacking for this ability to trigger. So, this is a banned counters deck, but it doesn't play in the normal counter fashion where you get a lot of +1/+1 counters. Here you are rewarded for gathering different types of counters. So what you need to do here is search for the word counter in the searcher, and then you get cards with different counters. One very good card for this deck that also comes with the deck is Agent's Toolkit. It's 1 and semi-chorus for an artifact clue. Agent's Toolkit enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter, a flying counter, a death touch counter, a seal counter, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may move a counter from Agent's Toolkit onto that creature. And it has also the clue ability for 2 to sacrifice draw card. So this is really good because it lets you give you 4 counters that you can spread around your creatures later, and it helps you later in the game when it doesn't have counters anymore to draw a card. So that's already a 4 buff on Perie. Now, there are a couple ways you can go for this deck. One is you go full Voltron, so kind of like Graphic, and that way you try to put counters like double strike counters or first strike counters or lifelink counters or death counters on Perie, and then you start attacking and killing players with command damage. What I would recommend instead of doing that, because command damage takes a lot of time, is actually going the infect route, because Perie has to attack but it can target any creature. That means that we could target a creature with infect, preferably something that already has evasion, and that way we have to deal only 10 damage to this player to kill, which with Perie it's actually kind of doable. The problem with this type of deck is that if you're putting counters on creatures, you need to ensure you have cards that will circumvent the loss of counters, because not all counters are recarable. For example, Ozolith and the new card Resourceful Defense do exactly that, where they allow you to essentially store the counter somewhere and then move them later. And Ozolith also does at the beginning of combat, so you get to put them on a creature and then swing with Perie and give that creature also the buff, or even Perie himself. Also very good in this deck, Reconnaissance, because you can just attack with Perie and don't care if your opponent is able to block and kill it. And also, generally you're playing banned, so you have enough counter spells, enough support, but remember you need to have different types of counters. So try to look at give different types of counters. Again, a reminder, the sagas have lock counters, so those count. Planeswalkers also have locked counters, and that they count. But I don't think that you will really want to run main Planeswalkers in this deck, because this is not a Super Friends deck. You could run just the good on them, so that you have counters to play around. Again, kind of interesting design. I would take it probably the infect route, or modulate a lot of different counters to do silly stuff, but just what you need to know is that the most common counters are +1/+1 counters, charge counters, loyalty counters. So after that you look at counters that maybe appear only on one type of card, so they're unique, and you fill your deck with those and you're good to go. Up next is the alternative command for the deck, Kros Defense Contractor. 1 and the bad colors for a 2/4 lets the creature cut advisor. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a shield counter on target creature and opponent controls, and whenever you put one or more counters on a creature you don't control, tap the creature and goad it. It gains trample until your next turn. Okay, so rules wise, the first ability obviously targets, and the shield counter is a counter that has a replacement effect where if the creature will be dead damage, sustaining damage on lethal, or it will be destroyed, you remove the counter instead. And for the second ability, you notice one or more counters, so no matter if we put one on 10 counters on a creature, the ability triggers only once. And you tap the creature, goaded. I have made a video on goad, which you can check right here. And it gains trample until your next turn. Okay, so essentially what this card does is you give a small benefit to creatures your opponents control to force them to attack each other because of the goading. Now, something very interesting here that you need to know is that goading doesn't exactly work in a 1v1 situation because there would be a force to attack you, which they probably inclined to do, so you need to somehow find a way to mitigate that. But let's see some of the cards that have high synergy with this commander. Obviously, one of the best cards when you're dealing with giving counters to other creatures is Generous Patron, because on the other, it has support too. So support can target even creatures you don't control. So you could play Generous Patron, give 2 of your opponents a counter, and then they will both be tapped due to Kros's second ability, then be goaded. Also, when you put one or more counters on a creature you don't control, you draw a card. So with Generous Patron here, you would play him, tap 2 of the creatures, goad them, they will gain trouble, and you draw 2 cards. Pretty good. Also, Forgotten Ancient, very good for a couple of reasons. First thing first, it grows really quickly because we're in a 4 player game, so you play commander. And second, the second ability doesn't have a target, so your opponents will have to respond before you choose where to move the counters. So if they kill your cross response, you just keep your Forgotten Ancient big. And another important thing here is that proliferation actually puts counters on creatures, and you put them, the player who proliferates does. So proliferate works very well because once you have got your opponent's team, you can just next turn find a way to proliferate, like with Evolution Change by playing a land, and then do it again. So it's essentially free value with your commander, and you know that as long as no one has some sort of protection or some sort of way to being able to ignore the goad, you will keep them fighting each other. Now, another very interesting card here is Nil's Disciple Enforcer, because at the beginning of your rest step, for each player you put a counter on a creature they control, so that immediately means that you essentially goad one creature for each player. Now note that this ability targets, so if the permanents have some sort of target protection, you cannot choose them. And also it makes it so that later down the line, when you be maybe in a 1v1 situation, you won't be able to be attacked so easily due to Nil's ability. Obviously Nil has no protection and it could easily be killed, but that's another issue. Also, Sheltering Agent, very good because it's a cumulative upkeep. You don't mind paying so much, and also the ability does not target. You just have to pay the cost for each counter on it. So you put, like, let's say it has 2 8 counters, it gets a third. You can choose 3 different creatures and put a counter on them and trigger Cross twice. Overall, I would say it's a pretty interesting commander as to what it tries to do, because it's again counter manipulation shenanigans, but you are trying to give them to your opponents so they attack each other. You need to have a good way to win the game though, because after you are on a 1v1 situation, you have the problem where you have given your opponent creatures with counters and you be facing them. So maybe an alternative with addition like Azor's Elecutors or further Sovereign is an option here. And the final new commander from the Brokers deck is Denry, Klin, Editor-in-Chief. Fun fact, this has already a faction on errata because it was misprinted as a text. So in the Oracle text it reads Denry, Klin, Editor-in-Chief, and the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 first strike counter or Vigilance counter on it. And whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if Denry has counters on it, put the same number of its count of counter on the creature. The printed text reads that put the same number and kind of counters to the creature, which you understand what it means, but it doesn't make sense. So this errata does nothing, it just means that you play a creature, then it has counters, you get the counters on it. Now, because of the wording on the first ability, and I don't know if this is intentional from Wizards Pass or not, if you see it says Denry, Editor-in-Chief ends the battle with a +1/+1 choice of a +1/+1 counter, first strike counter, Vigilance counter. So he enters with that counter, that's a replacement effect. So he could essentially enter as a 3/3 or as a 2 first striker or as a 2/2 with Vigilance. Now the second ability is interesting because it says whenever an non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if Denry has counters on it. Notice it doesn't say another. So what happens here is, because as we mentioned, Denry, Klin will enter with a counter. That means that that triggered ability, the second part, will actually see Denry have a counter where it itself enters the battlefield. And why this is important is because even though you cannot get two different counters with that ability, that means that if you choose the +1/+1 counter, Denry, Klin will enter the battlefield as a 4/4. Which is pretty interesting because it means that everything that comes after him gets even bigger if you choose the +1/+1 option. Now, this is a very interesting commander. Obviously, you can pile a lot of +1/+1 counters on him and the creatures will be huge when they enter. But I think the best option you can take this commander is with an infinite combo line. And what would that include is, because the commander itself has +1/+1 counter synergy, what do we use to counter that? Well, -1/-1 counters. So you can use persist creatures like Rival Kelpie and Less Masticore, and a sacrifice outlet that generates you something like Ashnod's Shadow or Phyrexian Altar. And essentially, because the creature will enter with a -1/-1 counter and then get a +1/+1 from Denry, it could create an infinite loop which will generate infinite resources. Now, I think Lesser Masticore is the best option because it also has an option to ping stuff. Also, Rival Kelpie does do that, so it's really good. Again, that's one route you could take it. It's a little bit tricky finding good creatures in the Azorius colors for that thing, but there is a couple creatures, so you can definitely combo that way. Even though white and blue are not very good at finding creatures or sending creatures to the graveyard, so you might need a bit of luck there. And also another thing you can do is go for a more traditional way like this commander was instead to pile him with a bunch of counters like double strike counters and trample counters and start making your creatures huge. And so you could do a little bit of a blink something. So if your creatures, for example, have counters that could be removed like seal counters, you can blink them and then we keep them back. I think that if you go that route, the best counter to give Denry is a hexproof counter, so it could not be so easily removed. Pretty interesting and unique format for Azorius overall. And these were the new commanders from the Bedecked Brokers deck. Overall, I like the direction that they try to go with the band color pairing, which was not really submerged into one category already, and the Azorius, which now they play around with more stuff other than just instant sorcerers doing things. Denry, Klin is a very nice inclusion, has some very cool infinite combos. The other one, Perie, is a kind of Voltron / effect commander, and Kros is a political slash find a way to kill the other players while they're killing each other through combat. Overall, I would say this is likely the most unique bunch of commanders out of all the other decks. Thank you all very much for watching. See you in the next video.